The phone rang just after midnight. Emily Carter sat up quickly, the cold air of her cabin pressing against her skin. Calls at this hour almost always meant trouble. She reached for the receiver, her heart already racing. A ranger's voice cracked on the other end. "We found a cub," he said. "Grizzly, alone. Mother's gone. If we don't act fast, he won't make it till morning." Emily didn't hesitate. She threw on her boots, grabbed her field pack, and stepped out into the darkness. The mountain air smelled of pine and frost. Somewhere out there in the wild spaces of Montana, near the Yellowstone boundary, a life was hanging by a thread. She drove through winding roads, headlights catching patches of fog and the brief glint of elk eyes. She knew this stretch of land intimately, valleys where bears dug for roots, streams where salmon once ran, thick hills where she had spent countless hours tracking paw prints in the mud. But this night felt different. The silence carried weight, like the land itself was holding its breath. When she arrived at the ranger station, two men stood over a cardboard box lined with a wool blanket. Inside, a grizzly cub, no bigger than a retriever puppy, lay motionless. His fur was matted, his breathing shallow, his eyes dull and half shut. A faint whimper rose and then faded, the sound almost too weak to register. Emily crouched down, her gloved hand resting gently against the cub's side. The ribs pressed sharply under the skin. The ranger shifted uncomfortably. "His mother was shot," he muttered. "Illegal, hunter after elk. Wrong place, wrong time." Emily closed her eyes for a moment. She had seen too many animals orphaned this way, casualties of greed, misjudgment, or conflict with humans. But this cub's situation was even harsher. Grizzly cubs depend on their mothers for 2 to 3 years. Without her, survival rates drop below 20%. Most simply starve or fall prey to wolves. Every hour mattered. She signaled for the men to help lift the box into her vehicle. The cub stirred faintly, one paw twitching. That small movement was enough. "Stay with me," Emily whispered. "We're not done yet." She pressed the accelerator, steering toward the rehabilitation center she had built near the Yellowstone River. The drive took nearly an hour, but she barely noticed the passing trees or the twisting cliffs. She was replaying the same thought, how to keep him alive through the night. With leopards, lions, even cheetahs, she had read about rescues in faraway places, but here in Montana, the stakes felt closer, heavier. Each species has its own fragility. Cubs like this, barely weaned, are rarely saved. But Emily had built her life around trying anyway. When she carried him into the small treatment room, the weight of his body shocked her. He was far too light for his aged bones, pressing through skin that should have been padded with fat. She laid him on heated blankets and prepared a syringe with milk formula used for orphaned carnivores. At first, his jaws stayed tight. She touched the drop of milk against his lip, hoping instinct would kick in. Nothing. Another drop. Still nothing. Hours passed like this. She kept trying, kept whispering words he could not understand, but maybe could feel. As the night wore on, Emily thought about why so many animals never make it. The first problem is energy. Starvation sets off a cascade in the body. Liver shutting down, circulation faltering, muscles refusing to respond. Without constant warmth and nutrition, the slide is irreversible. The second problem is fear. A cub taken from the wild often refuses food simply because stress overwhelms everything else. Fear burns calories faster than she can replace them. To counter it, she needed to provide not just formula, but presence. Steady voice, steady hands. The kind of reassurance a wild mother would give through touch and sound. By dawn, his breathing steadied slightly. His eyes opened a fraction, revealing the amber glow that all grizzly cubs share. For the first time, he seemed to register that someone was there. Emily let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She called him Kodiak, not after the island, but because the name carried weight, strength, a reminder of what he might become if he lived. That morning, she stepped outside, briefly watching the first light paint the mountain ridges. The Yellowstone ecosystem stretched out before her, 22 million acres of interconnected wilderness. Here, grizzlies dug for tubers in meadows, fished rivers in spring, and denned in snowy hillsides in winter. It was one of the last strongholds of the species in the lower 48 states. 40 years earlier, fewer than 140 grizzlies roamed here. Today, thanks to tireless protection, there are over 1,000. Still, each cub lost to poaching cars or conflict meant the future shrank a little more. Emily returned to the treatment room and found the cub shifting weakly, nose twitching toward her. She tried the syringe again. This time, he accepted a few drops, just enough to prove he wasn't giving up. In moments like this, it's easy to romanticize a woman saves a bear bond, forms instantly. But the truth is messier. Many cubs never pull through. Many die in spite of endless effort. What matters is the attempt, the refusal to look away. Emily often said later, "Every life deserves at least the chance to fight. We don't decide which ones are worthy. We just show up." That's the small lesson tucked into this night. Conservation isn't always about grand victories or sweeping landscapes. Sometimes it's about a cardboard box in the middle of the night and whether someone shows up to lift it. By midday, Kodiak was sleeping more peacefully. The ranger who had called her stopped by, clearly surprised to see the cub still alive. He asked if it was worth it, if investing so much time into one animal really mattered. Emily looked at the cub's rising chest, then back at him. "You never know who this one will become," she replied. "Maybe he survives. Maybe he teaches us something. That's worth it. And that's the fresh perspective this story offers. Each rescue, no matter how small, is a piece of the puzzle. Grizzly bears are not statistics to be managed. They are individuals, each carrying instincts, memories, and roles in the ecosystem. Save one cub, and you keep alive, not just a number, but a future. That first night ended with Emily slumped in a chair, exhaustion pressing down on her, but hope anchoring her forward. She had no idea what the next weeks would bring, only that this tiny bear had chosen, however faintly, to stay alive. Outside, the Yellowstone River ran cold and steady, carrying snowmelt from distant peaks. Somewhere up there, the land had lost a mother bear. But here in this room, a new story was beginning. Emily leaned close, whispering once more before she dimmed the lights. "You're not alone anymore." The hum of the heater filled the silence, and the cub's breathing matched its rhythm. This was just the first chapter. The sleepless nights, the fragile beginnings, the uncertain path toward trust. They still lie ahead. The first night with Kodiak stretched endlessly. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor beside the enclosure, syringe in hand, listening to the cub's shallow breaths. Every few minutes she tried again, pressing a bead of warm formula against his lips. Sometimes he swallowed. Most times he turned away. She kept track of each attempt in a notebook, the pages filling with uneven numbers that told her more about his chances than she wanted to admit. By 3 a.m., she leaned back against the wall, exhaustion burning through her. She could have left him to sleep, but instinct told her that consistency mattered more than comfort. Wild bear mothers rarely rest fully when raising young. They wake often to nudge, lick, and reassure. If she wanted this orphan to believe life was worth clinging to, she had to mirror that rhythm. When dawn came, she was still there, rocking slightly, whispering words he didn't understand, but maybe felt. At the center of rescue work lies a simple truth. Survival begins in the mind. If an animal loses the will to fight, no amount of medicine or formula will be enough. Emily had seen this happen before with fox kits and black bear cubs, tiny bodies that simply gave up after trauma. She refused to let Kodiak follow that path. During the day, she tried a new tactic. She dipped her finger into the milk and brushed it across his nose. At first, he sneezed, annoyed. Then, almost by accident, he licked the drop. She froze, hardly breathing, and repeated the motion. Another lick, another. Small, clumsy, but undeniable progress. That evening, he managed to drink from the syringe for nearly a full minute. She wrote the time in her notebook and underlined it twice. The following nights blurred into each other. Every 2 or 3 hours, she rose to prepare fresh formula, careful to warm it to body temperature. Her arms ached from holding the syringe steady, her voice grew hoarse from constant soothing. But gradually, Kodiak's responses changed. The faint whimpers became short huffs, the kind cubs make when nursing. His paws twitched more strongly as circulation improved. On the seventh night, he lifted his head unassisted, a shaky but determined gesture that brought Emily to tears. There were setbacks, too. On the eighth night, he refused all feeding jaws, clenched eyes dull again. Panic rippled through Emily. She checked his temperature, too low. She wrapped him against her chest inside her jacket, letting her own warmth transfer into his frail body. For hours, she sat like that, afraid to move. Just before sunrise, his paw pressed against her side and a weak lick touched her wrist. Relief poured through her so sharply it hurt. These were the fragile beginnings, progress measured not in leaps but in tiny moments. A swallow, a twitch, a glance. Each one became a lifeline. From a biological standpoint, this was the most critical window. Grizzly cubs are born blind and helpless, gaining strength slowly under the constant care of their mothers. Deprived of that, Kodiak had been pushed to the edge. The role of a rehabilitator is not to tame but to bridge, provide enough security for survival while still preserving the wild instincts needed later. That meant every choice mattered. Too much handling and he might imprint on humans. Too little and fear could crush his will. Emily walked this line carefully. She kept her touches brief, her voice calm, her presence steady. Instead of holding him often, she stayed near, letting her scent and rhythm become familiar without overwhelming him. At night, she played soft recordings of natural sounds, wind, moving through trees, the distant call of ravens, so that his world remained wild even within the walls of the enclosure. On the 11th night, something shifted. Emily had dozed off against the wall when a rough, wet sensation woke her. Kodiak had crawled close to the bars and was licking her hand. The action was small, but to Emily, it was monumental. In bear behavior, licking and gentle mouthing are signals of trust, the same gestures cubs use with their mothers. It meant he no longer saw her as a threat, but as comfort. She whispered, "You've decided to live." The cub huffed softly in response, almost like agreement. That was the turning point. After that night, his appetite grew steadily. He began finishing full syringes, then small bowls. His coat, once dull and patchy, started to shine. The bones pressing sharply under his skin softened as weight returned, and most importantly, his eyes changed. They no longer looked past her, but at her, alert and questioning. Perseverance is not about force, it's about presence. She could not make the cub survive. She could only stay beside him long enough for him to choose survival himself. The sleepless hours, the aching body, the endless patience that was the price of offering another creature a chance. An example came back to her from years before, when she tried to raise an abandoned black bear cub. She had pushed too fast, introducing solid food before the animal was ready. The cub developed digestive failure and didn't survive. That memory still weighed heavily. With Kodiak, she slowed down, listened more closely to his signals, adjusted each step according to what he showed her rather than what she wanted. It reminded her that rescue work is less about control and more about humility. Looking at Kodiak, now curled more comfortably on the blanket, she felt the difference. His survival wasn't guaranteed, but it was no longer impossible. He had begun to fight for himself. There's a fresh perspective hidden here for anyone who listens. We often see wild animals as symbols of power, of fear of wilderness, untamed. But up close in the middle of the night, they are fragile too. A grizzly cub destined one day to weigh hundreds of pounds and rule river valleys can begin his life as weak and vulnerable as any human infant. And in that shared vulnerability, connection becomes possible. By the end of the second week, Emily allowed herself 1 hour of uninterrupted sleep at a time. She still kept alarms set through the night, woke to check his breathing, and still sat with him through moments of panic. But she also began to plan. What would happen when he grew stronger? How would she prepare him for a world where trust in humans could kill him? Those questions pressed at the edges of her mind, but for now, the focus remained simple, one feeding at a time, one breath at a time. Late on the 14th night, as she refilled the syringe yet again, she looked at him and realized he was no longer the same fragile creature she had carried in a cardboard box. He had crossed an invisible line from dying to living. The journey ahead would be long, filled with risks she could only guess at, but the foundation had been laid. Emily recorded one final note in her book before turning off the light. He wants to live. And that was enough to carry her into the next stage where trust would deepen, instincts would emerge, and the fragile bond between woman and bear would be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. By the third week, Kodiak's body carried more strength. His legs no longer folded under him when he tried to stand. He waddled across the small enclosure awkward but determined, sniffing every corner. Emily watched closely. This stage was critical. His survival now depended on more than feeding. It hinged on learning trust without losing wildness. Trust, she knew, wasn't about cuddling or treating him like a pet. Grizzly bears are solitary by nature. Cubs bond deeply with their mothers. But once grown, they roam alone, defending territory with fierce independence. The goal wasn't to make Kodiak love her. The goal was to teach him that life could be safe enough to keep moving forward. Each morning, Emily followed the same ritual. She entered quietly, set down a small bowl of formula, and then sat a few feet away, motionless. At first, Kodiak ignored it, eyes locked on her body, tense. Only when she looked away did he approach. That became the pattern she offered he chose. Over time, the pauses shortened. Soon he began to eat even as she remained present. For an animal wired to be wary of everything, this was the beginning of fragile trust. To mimic natural lessons a mother bear would give Emily, introduced textures of the outside world. She spread pine needles on the floor, placed small logs in the enclosure, and tucked berries into hidden spots. At first, Kodiak pawed, clumsily confused. But within days, he started scratching, digging, and searching. Each discovery earned a satisfied snort. These behaviors weren't just play, they were survival skills. Wild grizzlies spend much of their lives foraging their powerful claws designed to dig for roots, grubs, and burrowing mammals. If Kodiak didn't practice now, he'd never be ready later. One afternoon, she placed a branch, heavy with choke cherries, just outside his reach. He eyed it, huffed, then toppled the branch with surprising force. Emily smiled. The lesson was working. He was learning to solve problems on his own. There were setbacks. One day, a visiting volunteer leaned too close to the enclosure. Kodiak, startled, lunged toward the bars with a deep growl. His reaction was pure instinct. Grizzlies don't tolerate sudden intrusions. Emily immediately restricted access. She reminded her staff, "He is not tame. He never will be. Our job is to respect that." That moment reinforced the line she walked daily. Nurture trust, but never erase wildness. From a biological perspective, these interactions mattered profoundly. Bears use body language and sound to communicate safety or threat. A soft huff, a lowered head, or a gentle paw press signals peace. An upright stance, an open mouth, or a sudden rush signals defense. Emily learned to read Kodiak's cues. When he pressed his head against the ground near her, it wasn't submission, it was comfort. When he circled once before lying down, it meant he felt secure enough to rest. The breakthrough came late one evening. Emily was cleaning near the enclosure when she felt a presence. She turned and saw Kodiak standing close to the bars, fixed on her. Slowly, carefully, he pressed his forehead against the metal. Emily crouched, extended her hand, and let it rest there. No force, no expectation, just stillness. For a long moment he remained like that, breathing evenly. It was his choice to close the distance. That was the moment trust became real. Examples from other rescues echoed in her mind. She remembered a lion cub in Kenya who never learned to distinguish people from safety. That cub grew into a young male who walked into villages drawn by human scent and was killed for it. She thought of a cheetah in Namibia that bonded too strongly with its caretaker and refused to hunt. It spent the rest of its life in captivity. Those failures haunted every rehabilitator. With Kodiak, she was determined not to repeat them. Love without boundaries can destroy the very life you're trying to save. To build trust responsibly, you must allow room for distance. That principle shaped every decision. No unnecessary petting, no constant presence, no shortcuts. Still, the bond deepened. By the 6th week, Kodiak began to follow her movements with quiet curiosity. When she entered to refresh water, he sniffed her boots. When she sat reading her notes nearby, he lay down, parallel, mirroring her stillness. These small behaviors showed recognition. He knew her scent, her rhythm, her role. Trust between humans and wild animals is not about dominance or affection, but about respect. Kodiak didn't need Emily to be his friend. He needed her to be reliable, consistent, and safe enough that his instincts could emerge without fear. In that way, trust wasn't about making him less wild, but about giving his wildness a chance to grow. One stormy night offered proof. Thunder rolled across the mountains, rattling the small center. Many animals panic in storms, but Kodiak remained calm, huffing softly, occasionally glancing toward the spot where Emily sat. He didn't need her to comfort him, only to be there. That presence, silent and steady, mattered more than touch. As weeks turned into months, Emily began taking cautious next steps. Short outings into controlled outdoor pens, logs to climb streams, to splash in dirt, to dig. Each time she stayed back observing. Kodiak explored cautiously at first, then with increasing confidence. He pawed at roots, tore bark, even rolled in mud with gleeful abandon. These were not tricks taught by humans. They were instincts resurfacing because fear no longer smothered them. Emily recorded his progress in her journal. Day 47. Dug for grubs on his own. Day 52. Climbed a log pile without prompting. Day 60. Showed curiosity toward the stream. These notes became more than records. They were a map of his readiness for a life beyond fences. The fragile trust between them was not about taming. It was about balance, enough connection to keep him alive through the vulnerable months, enough distance to ensure he could stand alone later. That paradox defined every rescue story, whether with grizzlies in Montana or leopards in Africa. Success meant stepping close enough to guide, then far enough to let go. By the end of that season, Kodiak's eyes gleamed with alertness. His body had filled out muscles, moving powerfully under his fur. He no longer resembled the limp cub in a cardboard box. He was becoming a young bear with instincts sharpened, trust grounded, and a future possible. Emily looked at him one evening as the sun sank over the mountains. He was gnawing on a log, huffing in satisfaction. She thought of the long nights, the failures of other rescues, the thin line she walked daily, and she realized something. Trust wasn't just his gift to her. It was also her discipline, her ability to honor boundaries, even when her heart wanted closeness. That lesson carried weight beyond animals. In every bond, human or wild, respect sustains what affection alone cannot. With Kodiak now stronger, the next challenge loomed, taking his first steps into the wider wilderness. For Emily, it meant testing whether all those months of quiet trust building would translate into survival outside fences. Spring returned to the Yellowstone highlands, with snow still clinging to the ridges, but meadows beginning to open. For Emily, this marked a new chapter. Kodiak had grown from fragile cub to sturdy yearling nearly as tall as her waist when he stood on all fours. His body told one story's strength. His eyes told another, curiosity burning for the world beyond fences. It was time. The first outing was cautious. Emily led him into a controlled pen just outside the rehabilitation center, an area planted with berry bushes and logs. She opened the gate and stepped back. For several seconds he froze, nostrils, twitching ears, swiveling. Then, slowly, he took a step. His paw pressed into the earth claws, digging into damp soil. Another step, another. Soon he was moving with a steady rhythm, testing the air, sniffing at every branch. Emily stayed still. She didn't coax or call. This was his moment. The shift was immediate. Instead of waiting for food in a bowl, he began pawing at the ground. He dug up roots, tore at logs, rolled over patches of grass. These were instincts resurfacing, written deep into his DNA. In the wild, nearly 80–90% of a grizzly's diet is vegetation roots, berries, grasses, even bulbs hidden beneath the soil. Kodiak was learning to forage not from a mother bear, but from instinct awakened once he felt safe enough to try. After an hour, he returned to the gate on his own. Emily opened it and he walked back into the enclosure without resistance. That choice mattered. It showed he felt secure both inside and outside, a balance critical for the next steps. Over the weeks, outings grew longer. He splashed into shallow streams, first tentative, then bold pawing at fish that darted away too quickly. Emily noted each attempt. Bears are not born knowing how to hunt. They learn through trial, failure, and repetition. She allowed him those failures, resisting the urge to intervene. The lesson here was clear. Resilience grows only when given the chance to fall short. One afternoon, he discovered a log crawling with insects. He ripped it apart, tongue flicking out to lap the larvae. Emily smiled, remembering how wild grizzlies consume thousands of insects each day, small calories adding up to survival. This was not play. It was training his senses, strengthening muscles, teaching persistence. The larger wilderness called too. Emily began walking him into buffer zones near the Yellowstone boundary. Always careful, always at a distance, but enough for him to smell elk scat, hear ravens circling, and feel wind carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. These experiences mattered. In captivity, animals often lose the subtle awareness required in the wild. By exposing him gradually, she was stitching those instincts back into his daily rhythm. There were tense moments. Once a sudden gust carried the scent of wolves. Kodiak froze, her bristling eyes scanning the horizon. For the first time, Emily saw the raw fear and calculation of a wild bear. He pressed against her leg briefly, then pulled away, choosing distance over comfort. That choice meant everything his survival instincts were intact. Emily often thought about climate change during these outings. Whitebark pines in Yellowstone, once a staple food, were dying off rapidly due to warming and beetle infestations. Bears like Kodiak would face landscapes different from their ancestors. Their survival would depend on adaptability, shifting diets, exploring new ranges. Watching him dig fish and forage reminded her that adaptability starts here in small daily lessons. Examples from other programs guided her. She recalled reading about orphaned leopards in Africa who failed to hunt after release because they had grown accustomed to hand-fed meat. She remembered a black bear in Colorado that raided trash bins after being raised too close to humans. Those cases ended in tragedy, euthanasia, failed reintroductions. The margin between success and failure was razor-thin. Teaching a wild animal to survive isn't about providing, it's about withholding. Resist the urge to solve every problem. Let hunger drive curiosity. Let failure sharpen instinct. Her role was less savior, more shadow. By midsummer, Kodiak began showing confidence. He no longer glanced back constantly during outings. He climbed slopes, rolled in wallows, and even startled a flock of grouse that exploded from the brush. Each action built a layer of independence. Emily knew these were milestones on the road to release. There were moments of joy, too. One evening, as the sky turned orange, Kodiak stood in a stream water rushing past his legs. He pawed clumsily, then lunged. To Emily's surprise, he emerged with a wriggling fish, dropping it instantly in shock. Then he tried again. This time he succeeded. He shook his head wildly, water spraying before devouring his prize. Emily laughed aloud, her voice carrying across the valley. In that clumsy moment, she saw not just survival, but possibility. From a fresh perspective, these outings were more than training sessions. They were reminders of the line between human and wild. Kodiak didn't need her affection in these moments. He needed space to test himself against the raw elements of Yellowstone. And she needed to remember that her pride and joy meant little compared to his ability to walk alone. Still, her heart pulled in two directions. Each success brought them closer to separation. Each step into the wild was a step away from her. That paradox weighed heavily. Nurture so he can leave. As autumn approached, the question loomed, would he be ready for full release or too habituated to humans? Emily replayed every interaction, searching for signs. Did he return to her too often? Did he seek her comfort more than his instincts? She documented carefully, knowing that one misstep could mean a bear lost to conflict later. By October, the answer seemed clearer. Kodiak was no longer the frail cub clinging to survival. He was a yearling with muscle awareness and habits aligned with the wild. Emily felt both pride and dread. Release was inevitable. The mystery lay not in whether he could survive the wilderness, but in whether their bond could survive his independence. As she closed the gate after one of his final outings, Kodiak huffed softly, glancing back with amber eyes that seemed to hold both recognition and distance. Emily whispered, "You're almost ready." And with that, the story moved toward its hardest chapter. Yet the turning point where she would have to decide, let him go fully wild or keep him safe in partial captivity. The first snow of the season dusted the high meadows. Emily watched Kodiak lumber through the enclosure, his coat thick, his muscles carrying the power of an animal no longer fragile. He pawed at frozen ground, then rolled onto his back, steam rising from his breath. To anyone else, he looked ready, strong, curious, wild. But to Emily, readiness was more complicated. Every rehabilitator faces this moment, deciding when and how to let go. In grizzly conservation, timing is everything. Released too early and a bear may starve or wander into human settlements. Released too late and captivity reshapes behavior-dulling survival instincts. Kodiak stood exactly at that crossroads. For weeks, Emily met with rangers and biologists. They spread maps across tables debating options. Full release into the Yellowstone backcountry meant freedom, but carried high risks. Young bears accustomed to humans sometimes seek campsites drawn by food scent. One mistake could lead to conflict, and conflict almost always ends with the bear's death. Semi-protected reserves offered safety from poachers and roads, but were by definition not fully wild. She remembered a case from Wyoming. A cub raised in captivity was released too close to ranch land. Months later, reports came in of a bear raiding chicken coops. The animal was euthanized, its rescuer devastated. That story haunted her. She vowed not to repeat it, but she also remembered success stories black bears reintroduced into North Carolina forests that went on to raise cubs of their own. A reminder that with care and timing, survival was possible. These examples weighed heavily as she considered Kodiak's fate. Each evening, she walked the perimeter, watching him forage, dig, and test his strength. She wrote notes. Independent foraging strong, avoids human scent when introduced. Defensive posture is healthy. She tried to see him not through the lens of affection, but as data points, signals of readiness. Still, her heart ached at the thought of not seeing him run to her anymore. True care sometimes means stepping back. What feels safe to us can become a prison to another. Keeping Kodiak too close might protect him in the short term, but rob him of the life nature intended. One morning, she tested his response to her presence. Instead of approaching, he stayed at a distance, nose to the wind, tracking unseen scents. That choice thrilled her. It meant his wild instincts were stronger than attachment. He was telling her, in the only way he could, "I am ready to stand on my own." Still, doubt gnawed at her. In conservation work, no decision is pure. Release could mean freedom or a death sentence. Captivity could mean safety or a slow erosion of wildness. She carried the paradox like a weight in her chest. In search of clarity, Emily spoke with a veteran ranger who had overseen grizzly recovery since the 1970s. He told her bluntly, "No bear belongs in a cage forever. We protect them, but we can't replace the wilderness. If he's showing signs of wildness, you honor that." His words echoed long after the conversation ended. From a fresh perspective, the decision wasn't just about Kodiak. It was about trust. Trust in the process. Trust in the instincts written into his bloodline. Trust that the work she had poured into him was enough. In many ways, this was her own test of faith. The logistics took weeks to finalize. Rangers identified a release site near the Beartooth Mountains, an area rich in berries, fish, and denning sites, but far from major roads. Emily prepared a transport crate lined with pine boughs to reduce stress. She practiced loading and unloading him in mock runs so the day wouldn't overwhelm him. Each step was deliberate, each detail crucial. The night before the release, she sat beside his enclosure one last time. He paced slowly, then settled near the bars, eyes gleaming in moonlight. She whispered, "Tomorrow, you go home." He blinked, huffed softly, and looked away toward the mountains. That glance told her everything his world was already out there waiting. Release day dawned cold and clear. The crate rattled as Kodiak shifted inside restless. Emily rode in the back of the truck, steadying her hand against the wood. Every bump in the road tightened her chest. She whispered words only he could hear, though she knew he didn't need them anymore. When they arrived, rangers unloaded the crate onto open ground. Snow stretched in all directions, the peaks of the Beartooths rising sharply against the sky. Emily crouched at a distance, heart pounding. The door lifted. For a moment, nothing. Then a massive paw emerged, claws digging into snow. Kodiak stepped out slowly, sniffing, scanning. His body tensed, then relaxed. He walked forward, each step surer than the last. At the edge of the clearing, he paused and turned his head. Their eyes met. No sound, no movement, just a silent acknowledgement. Then he moved on, disappearing into trees that swallowed him whole. Emily remained frozen, tears hot against the cold wind. The mystery of what lay ahead for him hung heavy. Would he find enough food? Would he encounter danger? She had no answers, only the knowledge that she had given him his chance. This turning point carried a deeper message for her, and anyone watching letting go is not weakness. It is the truest form of respect. To keep him close might soothe her own heart, but it would deny him the life he was built for. The courage was not in holding on, but in opening the gate. As the rangers packed up, one placed a hand on her shoulder. He's where he belongs now. Emily nodded, though her throat was too tight for words. On the drive back, she stared at the snow-dusted peaks fading behind her. She knew this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Kodiak's story would continue unseen, written in paw prints across valleys and meadows. Her role had shifted from caretaker to witness, from holding his life in her hands to trusting it to the wilderness. The day after Kodiak's release, Emily returned to the site alone. The snow still held the marks of his first tracks. Claw prints pressed deep, each one pointing toward the timberline. She followed them for a while, her boots crunching softly in the cold until the wind erased them in drifts. The wilderness had already begun to claim him. Goodbyes in conservation work are not ceremonies. They happen quietly, often in solitude. For Emily, the hardest part was not the act of opening the crate. It was walking away afterward, resisting the urge to call out to keep him near for one more moment. She knew that every second she lingered, every reminder of her presence risked pulling him back toward a dependency. The hardest mercy was silence. She sat on a fallen log overlooking the valley. In the distance, the Beartooth Mountains cut sharply against the winter sky. This land had always been grizzly country, long before roads and fences. For decades, their numbers had collapsed under hunting habitat loss and conflict. In 1975, grizzlies in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem were placed on the endangered species list. At the time, fewer than 140 remained. Through decades of protection, careful management, and the tireless work of rangers, their population now stood at just over 1,000. A success, but still fragile. One bad policy change, one spike in conflict, and that progress could unravel. Emily thought of that as she watched the horizon. Kodiak was one bear among many, but his survival carried meaning. Each animal saved was not just an individual life, but part of a larger fight to keep wildness alive in a world shrinking under human hands. She remembered a conversation with a colleague years earlier. He had rescued an orphaned black bear and released her into the Smoky Mountains. For months, there was no sign. Then one spring, a wildlife camera captured the bear with 2 cubs of her own. That single moment validated years of doubt. Emily carried that story like a lantern, now imagining one day a ranger's camera might catch Kodiak, roaming strong, maybe even raising a next generation. Yet uncertainty gnawed at her. Not all stories end in triumph. She knew examples where released bears wandered too close to roads and were struck by cars, or raided livestock and were shot. The line between survival and tragedy was razor thin. The wilderness gave no guarantees. The small lesson in this goodbye was not about certainty, but about acceptance. In releasing him, she had accepted that her role ended at the edge of the forest. Beyond that, his fate belonged to him and the land. Control had never truly been hers. It was always an illusion. Before leaving, Emily laid a pine branch on the ground where his tracks began. It was not a marker, not a ritual, just a gesture. She whispered, "Run well," and turned back toward her vehicle. Driving away, she caught sight of a raven circling above the trees. Ravens often shadow grizzlies, scavenging from their kills, living in a partnership older than memory. It struck her as a symbol: where there are ravens, there is bear life nearby. She held on to that thought as a quiet reassurance. Conservation is not about ownership. It is about a relationship. We are not keepers of wild animals, but stewards of the conditions that allow them to thrive. Emily's bond with Kodiak mattered, but not because she possessed him. It mattered because it reminded her, and anyone listening, that love for wild creatures finds its highest expression in letting them remain wild. That evening, back at the center, Emily walked past empty enclosures. For the first time in months, the space felt still. She sat with her journal and wrote, "He is gone." And that is exactly as it should be. The words ached, but carried freedom. The emotional toll of these partings was real. Many rehabilitators burn out, overwhelmed by the cycle of rescue, nurture, release, and loss. Some walk away entirely unable to face the constant weight of uncertain endings. Emily had nearly given herself after losing animals in earlier years, but she had learned to frame goodbyes differently. Each farewell was not a loss, but a handoff, a continuation of a story she could no longer see, but which the wild carried forward. The following week, she returned once more to check on signs in the release area. No tracks, no sightings. For some, that absence would sting. For Emily, it was enough. Silence meant he was not lingering by roads or camps. Silence meant he was finding his own path. That perspective matters beyond one bear. In human lives, we often cling tightly, believing love is proven by proximity. But wildness teaches another lesson. Sometimes love proves itself in distance, in the courage to let go. As the sun dipped behind the peaks, she whispered one last goodbye into the cold air. The sound was swallowed by wind, carried perhaps toward valleys where Kodiak roamed unseen. Her journey with him had ended at Yellowstone's edge, but their story was not over. The bond forged in sleepless nights and fragile beginnings still pulsed quietly, invisible but unbroken. What lay ahead was unknown. But sometimes mystery itself's the gift. Winter passed, then spring, then summer. Emily carried on with her work at the rehabilitation center. Injured hawks, orphaned fox kits, the occasional black bear cub. Life pressed forward, but every so often in quiet moments, her thoughts returned to the grizzly she had released. She wondered if Kodiak had denned safely through the snow, if he had found enough food in spring, if he had survived at all. 3 seasons after his release, she was called to check on a wounded elk near a meadow close to the Lamar Valley. The sun was just setting when she arrived, shadows stretching long across the grass. She crouched, scanning for tracks, when a low rumble echoed through the trees. Her pulse quickened. It was not the bugle of an elk. It was the deep, resonant sound of a bear. For a moment, she froze. In Yellowstone, encounters with wild grizzlies often end badly for humans who misjudge the distance. She stood slowly, her eyes searching the tree line. Branches parted. A massive figure stepped forward, heavier, broader, his coat thick and shining. Emily's breath caught. The bear stopped 20 yards away, head lifted, nostrils flaring. Recognition hung in the air like a question. Then it happened. Kodiak huffed softly, the same sound he had made as a cub during late-night feedings. He lowered his head, walked forward in deliberate strides, and closed the distance not with aggression, but with calm certainty. Emily's heart pounded, but not from fear. She knew that gait. She had seen it countless times when he was smaller, approaching for food or reassurance. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the amber light in his eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Kodiak pressed his head gently toward her leg, a gesture of trust so vulnerable that it stole her breath. A grizzly capable of tearing down trees chooses instead to lean in with gentleness. This reunion carried a weight beyond sentiment. Science tells us that bears recognize individuals through scent and memory. Studies in Alaska have shown that grizzlies can recall food sites years later. If they can remember landscapes, why not? Faces Kodiak's behavior offered living proof. Bonds can endure even after separation, even after wildness reclaims an animal. Emily whispered his name, though she knew better than to reach out. She held her ground, allowing him to decide how long the moment lasted. After a few breaths, he pulled away, circling once, then settling near the grass, as though simply keeping her company. She sat down carefully, heart still racing, and the two shared a silence broken only by wind and distant bird calls. Examples from other species echoed in her mind. In Africa, elephants have been known to recognize researchers decades later. In sanctuaries, rescued wolves howl in chorus when old caretakers visit after years apart. Such stories reveal a truth often underestimated: memory in wild animals is not limited to survival cues. It extends to relationships. Kodiak's return underscored that bears too carry such depth. Bonds built on respect do not vanish with distance. By refusing to treat him as a pet, by honoring his wildness, she had given him space to grow into himself. And in return, he chose to show her trust on his terms, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. She left the meadow only when darkness pressed in. Kodiak followed her partway, then stopped at the tree line, watching as she disappeared down the trail. She didn't look back, but she felt his presence long after. Over the following months, there were more encounters. Each time Kodiak appeared from the forest unexpectedly, sometimes while she was on patrol, sometimes during her visits with rangers. Each time he greeted her not with dominance, but with joy disguised in huffs and soft growls. He ran circles around her, rubbed against trees nearby, and occasionally pressed his head toward her hand before retreating again. For visitors who witnessed these scenes, the sight of a wild grizzly showing such gentleness to a human was almost unbelievable. Some cried, others stood in stunned silence. From a fresh perspective, these reunions challenged common assumptions. Too often the narrative around grizzlies in North America is framed by fear: livestock raids, campground warnings, tragic attacks. Those dangers are real, but Kodiak's story revealed another side: the capacity for memory, for recognition, for bonds that cross species. It didn't erase the risks. It reframed them, reminding people that fear is not the only lens through which to see wildlife. Emily remained careful. She never approached him deliberately, never allowed tourists or untrained staff to get close. Boundaries were sacred. She knew too well how quickly trust could be broken if people tried to replicate what they saw. He is not tame, she reminded anyone who asked. He is wild, and that's why our connection still exists. It survives only because I respect it. Her words mattered in a broader conservation context. Across Montana and Wyoming, hundreds of bears are killed each year due to human conflict, raiding garbage, approaching livestock, wandering near highways. Many of those deaths trace back to small breaches of boundary, a camp left unclean, food left unsecured. Curiosity encouraged rather than discouraged. Kodiak's survival showed what could happen when boundaries were honored instead. Emily often thought of him during quiet evenings at the center. She would imagine him roaming high ridges, fishing in streams, and digging for roots in meadows. He had become part of the Yellowstone ecosystem, no longer dependent fully himself. Yet each time he appeared near her, he reminded her that wildness and connection were not opposites. They could coexist if respect guided every step. The mystery remained: why him? Why her? Why this bond? Some questions resist answers. Perhaps it was simply the countless hours of sleepless nights when his survival was uncertain, etched into his memory as deeply as into hers. Or perhaps it was something less tangible. A recognition that life once shared never fully separates. Whatever the reason, the reunion stood as testimony, not to taming, not to ownership, but to trust that had crossed the invisible boundary between human and wild. As she left the meadow one autumn evening, the sun dipped behind the peaks, casting Kodiak's silhouette against the horizon. He raised his head and let out a low, rolling growl, not warning, not threat, but the sound bears make when acknowledging presence. Emily lifted her hand in silent reply. Their story was no longer about survival alone. It had become about continuity, about the resilience of bonds, even in the face of distance and time. The last time Emily saw Kodiak that autumn, he did something she had never expected. He rolled onto his back in the meadow, paws in the air, exposing his belly to her. For any grizzly bear, that gesture is rare. It is pure vulnerability, a sign of absolute trust. She stood quietly, hands at her sides, letting the moment hold them both. In that gesture, Kodiak told her more than words ever could. He was wild, but he still remembered. Walking back to her vehicle, Emily carried a mixture of pride and ache. She knew their paths would always diverge, that each meeting might be the last. Yet she also understood that their bond was not fragile. It was resilient, built on respect rather than possession. This was the emotional payoff of years of sleepless nights, fragile beginnings, and hard choices. Not ownership, not taming, but trust enduring even in separation. That trust carried a broader meaning. Across Montana and Wyoming, 30 to 40 grizzlies die each year in conflicts with humans, killed for raiding garbage bins, shot near ranches, struck by cars. Each of those deaths is preventable. Bears don't choose conflict, they follow instincts to find food and survive. When people secure campsites, manage livestock responsibly, and keep wild animals wild, lives are saved. Kodiak's survival shows what's possible when respect guides every interaction. Emily often shared this lesson with visitors. I don't own him. I never did. My role was only to give him a chance. That perspective matters in a world where wild animals are often reduced to tourist attractions, pets, or statistics. Kodiak was none of those things. He was an individual with memory instincts and a place in the Yellowstone ecosystem. Respecting that individuality is the foundation of real conservation. Examples from around the world echo this truth. In South Africa, orphaned leopards have been raised and reintroduced, some thriving, others lost to conflict when boundaries blurred. In Alaska, polar bears wander starving as sea ice melts, forcing them closer to human settlements. In every case, the lesson is the same. When humans forget that wild animals must remain wild, tragedy follows. But when people respect boundaries, survival and coexistence become possible. The knowledge gained from Kodiak's journey also adds to our understanding of grizzly behavior. Cubs learn survival not only through instinct, but through opportunity. They forage, fail, and try again. They carry memories strong enough to recognize humans years later. They balance curiosity with caution, wildness with trust. Knowing this helps conservationists refine how they raise and release orphans, when to step close, when to step back. But beyond science, the story resonates because it touches something deeper in us. Watching a bear once thought doomed walk free in the mountains stirs hope. Seeing him choose to greet the woman who saved him reminds us of the invisible threads that connect all life. Kodiak's story says survival is not only about strength. It is also about trust, resilience, and the bonds we choose to honor. Courage in conservation is not just about fighting poachers or protecting habitats. Sometimes it is about patience, about resisting the urge to hold on, about letting go when the time comes. That lesson applies beyond wildlife. In our own lives, relationships and struggles, true care often means allowing space for growth, even when it hurts. From a fresh perspective, Kodiak's journey is more than a wildlife story. It is a mirror. It asks us, what would it look like if we treated every creature, human or not, with respect for their wildness? What if we built trust not through control but through patience? What if we saw ourselves as part of the ecosystem? Not above it, Emily still visits the valley sometimes. She doesn't always see him. Sometimes she finds only tracks in the mud, claw marks on a tree or a patch of grass pressed down where he might have slept. But each sign tells her he is alive, thriving, carving his path as a true grizzly bear. That is enough. And here is where the story turns back to us. Kodiak's survival depended on one person's choice to act, to stay awake through the nights, to trust that even the weakest life was worth fighting for. We may never raise a grizzly cub, but each of us faces choices about how we treat the wild world around us. Do we secure our garbage when camping? Do we support conservation organizations that protect endangered animals? Do we teach respect for wildlife to the next generation? Small actions build into legacies. So as you reflect on Emily and Kodiak's journey, ask yourself, what is one step you can take to protect the wildness that remains on this planet? Maybe it's donating to a wildlife sanctuary. Maybe it's volunteering at a local park. Maybe it's as simple as pausing to respect the next wild animal you encounter, seeing it not as a threat or novelty, but as a neighbor with its own place in the world. Kodiak's story proves that trust once built can bridge even the widest boundaries. It shows that when we act with respect and courage, the line between human and wild is not a wall, but a shared horizon. And now, I want to turn it over to you. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on the bonds in your own life, the ways you can show respect and trust. And if you believe more people need to hear stories like Kodiak's, stories of resilience, survival, and connection, then I invite you to support this channel. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that even in a divided world, love and respect can still cross every boundary. Because in the end, Kodiak's gift to us is not just his survival. It is the reminder that wildness, trust, and connection still live among us, waiting for us to honor them.